Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. One of the techniques that a lot of people practice when they're starting off in street photography is shooting from the hip. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the idea that rather than bringing the camera to your eye, instead you have it at about hip height and you shoot without looking through the viewfinder. It's sort of a less intimidating way of taking pictures of strangers as you're walking down the street. The disadvantage there is that you never know exactly what you're going to get in terms of framing and composition. You're leaving a lot of things to chance. Now, with cameras with tilting LCD screens, well, a lot of that chance is sort of eliminated because you are sort of looking down at a screen in order to compose your shot. But everyone knows that what you're doing. So if you're trying to sort of fool people into thinking that you're not making a photograph and you're using a tilty screen, people kind of get the sense of what you're doing, that you're making photographs. And I think for the most part, either people care or don't care, usually the latter. But for photographers who feel a certain level of anxiety or discomfort about making shots at eye level, especially of strangers that are only, 5 feet away or maybe even less, shooting from the hip seems like a viable way to go. So I shoot from the hip, but I often will use a LCD screen to help frame my compositions just because I like that lower point of view as opposed to shooting it at eye level. It's one of the reasons why I like cameras that have those tilty screens, because this perspective, for me, in some shots is so much better. But regardless of the reason why you're doing it, I picked 3 shots here to sort of talk a little bit about the points that I kind of focus on when I'm shooting from the hip. All right, we have a shot here by Peter Foster. This was shot with a Sony NEX 5T, shot at 1/200th of a second at f7.1, ISO 1600. So we here have this woman walking down the street on a rainy day. And one of the things that I've kind of learned in terms of shooting from the street, and I kind of talked a little bit about this last week, is the whole idea of being conscious of everything else that's in the frame. Because even though you're choosing to shoot from the hip because you don't want to create awareness of you making a photograph, when you're doing that, you're focusing so much on the person and whether or not the person's going to recognize that you're making a photograph that you fail to pay attention to all the other things that eventually end up in the shot. So you can see this scene here, and I like the perspective on this in the fact that we have like these 2 converging sidewalks, the one on the left that's leading away down the street, and the one to the right where we have this black post, and some garbage, some windows to what appears to be like an office building. I like that kind of perspective. I like going to street corners when I'm shooting from the hip because I like the lines that creates. You have these lines coming in from the left, you have these lines coming into the right, all that lead to this point here where the subject ends up walking into the frame. So if you've seen some of my earlier videos, you know I'm always looking for setting. I'm always trying to find a spot where I think that the lighting is interesting, where the lines and the graphics and just the overall scene seems to be interesting even without a person there. So graphically, I like what's happening here. Because it's a cloudy day, the light isn't particularly stupendous. It's, overcast, so it's really pretty even. So you really are dependent on someone interesting coming into the frame, which this woman certainly is. And Peter manages to get her at a really good moment. Her hands are really expressive here in her right. She has her phone, which is extended out a little bit. And then she has with her left hand, she's grasping her jacket as if she's trying to keep it closed because it's particularly chilly. And the expression on her face is kind of interesting. I don't know if she'd find it particularly flattering, but I think all those things in combination really kind of work well together. And I think that the perspective here is good. I like the fact that the camera isn't at eye level because those lines that are created by the overall scene, especially the lines created by the sidewalk, all become really important with the way that they direct us here to this area of the frame. The thing that I would have concerned myself with is this sign here. We see this post here. We can't see what exactly the sign reads, but that's one of the things about shooting from the hip does, is that if you're shooting from the hip, sometimes you won't be aware of this stuff, at least how they juxtapose with your subject, until it's too late, until you've already made the photograph. If I had been composing this using an LCD or using a viewfinder, I would have looked at this overall scene and would have recognized, oh, I got this sign here. So I'm going to have to time it so that my subject is juxtaposed over this, so I'm not getting any bit of this sign. Now, if you're shooting from the hip and you are not looking through the viewfinder, it's going to be hard to discern how distracting elements can end up finding their way into your shots. It's one of the disadvantages of shooting from the hip is that you can get an overall sense with your eye in terms of what you're going to include in the frame, but it's not until you make the photograph that you do. So while you may see a shot here, you make a shot and you go, oh, I better try and time it so that that person isn't in the frame. If you're shooting from the hip, you really have no way of being able to anticipate when that person is going to be in the right position, which is one of the reasons I prefer to shoot with the camera at eye level, because just from experience, I've learned that most people do not care that you're out there making photographs. And if you've already staked a spot out in which you're making photographs and you already exist in that space, most people that are walking through are assuming that you're taking a picture of something else and not them anyway. All right, here we have a picture by Robert Eugene Miller. No XF information here. Here's another shot. Very same thing, right? Here the light is a little more interesting because we have this light that's sort of coming overhead, and it looks like this building is a business, an office building or a hotel. And the light that falls down on this woman is really interesting, and you can see how the shadows are a lot more dramatic, especially underneath her chin. And the way that just light falls on her is really, really nice. But here we're dealing with a similar sort of angle, right? We're dealing with an angle, this diagonal angle. We have all these implied lines, diagonal lines that exist throughout the frame. So everything's sort of small here, and they seem to expand as we move from right to left, the same direction in which the subject is moving. And here, again, it's at about chest level. Maybe not as low as the waist, but you can see how that perspective helps to guide the eye up to her face. And here, framing is really, really good. She is in the center of the frame, but I think that even though the subject is in the center of the frame, the overall of the composition works really kind of nicely, largely because of those lines and also because of the contrast in tone. You have these repeating patterns here that are illuminated directly by light. We have that here as well. We have some of it here, but this is more relegated to shadow. So I like the sort of the balance between the sort of the darker area here and the brighter areas here, and how she sort of settles right in the middle. And she strikes that same balance of dark as exhibited by her sweat top, and the brighter areas of her face and the scarf that she's wearing around her head. And even though we don't have her hands in the shot like in the previous photograph, what I do like is that expression. She seems very focused, very determined, and it's just, she seems like she's really focused on where she was going. So even if the photographer had the eye to the camera, it seems to me that she just would have kept on walking because she was so in her own world, in her own mind, that she wouldn't have noticed it at all. Now we have this figure here in the distance here who's looking in the opposite way with their hand to their eye, and I really like having that figure in the frame. Even though some of the detail is sort of lost within this area of shadow, I think it serves as a nice counterpoint. There's the presence of people other than the woman that's exhibited by this person, and we also see the legs and the hand of another person that we can see right here in the reflection here. So there are three people in this frame, and but it's her that we're focusing on. And again, shooting from this perspective allows for sort of a dramatic point of view because you're shooting up, and whenever you're shooting up on someone, that often infuses the shot with sense of power rather than when you're shooting down on someone. It creates a really great visual effect with the right subject and with the right setting. But again, it's about paying attention to everything else that's in the frame, because I think compositionally, this frame works really nicely. Even if you didn't have the woman in there, I think you would have some really strong bones in terms of the overall composition. But having her in the shot, having her expression, her clothing, the tonality, and the way the light falls on her really makes this shot work, considering that it's shot from the hip. Now here we have another shot by Barry Lowman, shot with an Olympus EM5 at ISO 200 at 1/60th of a second. We don't have an f-stop here. Now this is a technique in which you're definitely shooting from the hip, but on top of that you're actually using flash, and there's some photographers out there who are sort of famous for using this kind of technique, in which shooting from the hip allows you to get a lot closer than you would than if you were shooting from the eye. You're really shooting up on a subject, and in this case using the flash, and you can see the perspective. This is an extreme perspective now as compared to the other two shots that where you really are shooting up on someone. So you get to see the nostrils, you get to see like the teeth, you get to see underneath the brim of the hat. This is a perspective that normally we do not see when we're looking at people as we're walking around the street or walking whatever type of scene. This is a real purposeful choice, and for some people they really dislike it. They don't think it's flattering. They just it's especially because of the proximity that's created. Some people see it as more of a violation. I'm not going to judge it in terms of those perspectives. That's for other people to decide. But in terms of just photographically speaking, it is an interesting shot as a result of the proximity, how close they are, and this point of view. The shot, the body of the person, the jacket is really dominant here on the frame, and it's made all the more so because of the way that the flash is reflected off of the jacket. But we still go to the face because it is the brightest element in the frame, and also the most color saturated, and also has some really interesting points of contrast in terms of the skin color as compared to the color of the hat and the color of the jacket. Now we do have those trees in the back, and one of the age-old tropes of things you want to avoid in a shot are trees growing out of people's heads. Well, in this case, it's completely unavoidable, but it ends up being an important part of the shot, even though they are growing out of there, out of the subject. It creates all these sort of graphic lines, and it ends up feeling a little bit sort of creepy as a result of the presence of those trees and the point of view and the use of the flash. There's a certain degree of tension and anxiety that I feel when I'm taking a look at that photograph. And I think that can be said for a lot of photographs that are sort of made like this. And I don't know whether that's the intention of Barry here or any other photographers that use this particular approach. But that tension, that feeling that you get when you feel like, oh, I'm really intruding on someone's space, really comes across in shots that are like these. But getting back to the whole idea of shooting from the hip, you can really see how shooting from the hip can also allow you to get much closer than you typically would when you're just shooting at eye level. When you're shooting at eye level and you're unaccustomed to it, you usually shoot at a good distance, like maybe 10 or 15 feet. That's kind of the sweet spot that I see a lot of people shoot at when they're doing street work for the first time and they're not particularly comfortable with approaching. The longer you do it and the more comfortable you get, you find yourself getting closer and closer. Because for me, my sweet spot is like 5 feet or less. And I'm shooting at eye level and I'm shooting from the hip. I'm using both techniques. But for me, a lot of the time, I don't like being 15 feet away trying to make street photographs. I feel like it includes too much in the frame. There are just too many distracting elements. I'm really trying to make it as simple and as clean as possible. And one of the ways that I do that is by getting closer. But regardless of what technique that you're approaching, it's really important to just be conscious of everything that you're potentially going to include in the frame. So if you are going to shoot from the hip, don't just walk up and down the street just shooting from the hip just because you see someone interesting and just making the shot and crossing your fingers and hoping that you get something interesting. What I'm suggesting is that take a shot before anyone has entered the frame and just take a look at what the overall scene looks like. You may find that there may be elements in that frame from the point from which you'd be shooting that would not serve the photograph. It could be signage, it could be bad lighting, it could be any host of things. But what you end up doing by just carefully sort of building your photographs, as I suggest, over and over and over again, even shooting from the hip, you can create the potential for a better photograph, whether you're shooting from the hip or shooting from eye level. Hope you found that helpful. If you want to contribute images to the Candid Frame Flickr pool, you can do so by just going to Flickr, typing in the Candid Frame, and ask to be added, and I'll be glad to do it. I usually do it once a week, so if I don't get to it immediately, don't worry. I will add everyone who asks to be added, and there's some wonderful work to be found there. And if you've not heard of the Candid Frame, well, it's a podcast which features conversations with some of the world's best photographers. The feed is now available on YouTube, so if you are subscribed to this YouTube channel, you'll get the episodes out each week on Sunday as they're released. But they are also available as a podcast that you can download to your tablet or phone or your computer. We do have a free Candid Frame app that allows you access to the entire archive of interviews completely for free. But if you want to check out the site and check out the guests, you can go to thecandidframe.com. Our recent interview is with master portrait photographer and illustrator Dan Winters, who you know his work, even if you may not know his name. He has a new book out of street photography from New York City. So if you're listening and watching this channel and you love street photography, you most definitely have to check out this book. But before then, check out the interview on the Candid Frame. So thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next time.